My name is Tinley Myers, 32 years old, and I am a captain in the United States Army. After months on deployment, I returned to my childhood home in Galveston, Texas, only to have a glass candle holder shatter against the wall inches from my head. My mother's voice shrieked, "You uneducated piece of trash," while my father pointed a trembling finger at the door and barked, "Get out of my house." They had no idea that while they were busy forging my signature on $42,000 in debt to fund my brother Ryan's fake lifestyle, I had already initiated a restricted forensic audit with the JAG. They certainly didn't expect that the million-dollar mansion in Malibu they were so desperate to claim was a secret I had already legally sealed away. I didn't cry or argue. I just picked up my duffel bag and walked out into the Texas rain, because in the military, silence is just the first step of loading the chamber. If this story hits home, like and subscribe. Leave your local time in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. The heat in Galveston always had a way of sticking to your skin, but inside my parents' kitchen, the air was cold enough to kill. I stood by the counter, my back straight, my feet planted firmly on the linoleum floor. I didn't move when the glass candle holder flew past my ear. It hit the floral wallpaper behind me and exploded into 100 sharp pieces. The sound was like a gunshot in a room that was already dying. My mother was leaning over the dining table, her hands clutching the edge so hard her knuckles were white. Her face was twisted, the skin around her neck tight and red, with a rage she didn't even try to hide. "You uneducated piece of trash," she spat. The words were meant to cut, to draw blood, to remind me that no matter where I had been or what I had achieved, I was still nothing to her. I didn't blink. I kept my eyes locked on my father. He was sitting at the head of the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He looked old, his authority slipping through his shaky fingers like sand. The smell of burnt pot roast was everywhere. It was thick and heavy, filling the house with the scent of a ruined dinner. My father finally looked up, his eyes glassy with a mix of fear and anger. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the door. He raised one hand, his index finger trembling as he pointed toward the exit. "Get out of my house," he rasped. Next to him, my brother Ryan sat perfectly still. He was the golden child, the one who never did anything wrong in their eyes, even when he was burning through money that wasn't his. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly paycheck, probably paid for with the credit he'd stolen using my name. He pretended to look down at his empty plate, trying to act like he was ashamed, but I saw it. I saw the way the corner of his mouth twitched. It was a smirk, a small, ugly victory. He had finally pushed me out, and now he could have whatever was left of the wreckage. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I had learned a long time ago that in this family, my emotions were just more fuel for their fire. Instead, I reached down and picked up my heavy bag from the floor. It was the only thing I was taking with me. I checked the zipper, pulling it tight with a quick, practiced motion that felt as natural as breathing. It was a habit I couldn't shake, a small piece of order in a room full of chaos. I looked at my mother one last time. She was waiting for me to beg, to apologize for something I hadn't even done. I took a breath, my voice steady and flat. "Okay," I said. Just one word. It was enough to strip away the drama they were trying to create. Their shouting and their threats suddenly felt small and pathetic compared to the silence I brought with me. I turned around and walked toward the door. My heavy boots hit the wooden floorboards with a dull, rhythmic thud that echoed through the hallway. I didn't look back. I stepped out onto the porch and into the Texas rain. The cold downpour washed away the heat of the afternoon. I walked down the driveway to my truck, my clothes soaking through in seconds. I climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. My hands didn't shake. I stared through the windshield as the wipers fought back the water, looking at the house one last time. It was a place built on lies and stolen dreams. I started the engine. I put it in gear and pressed the gas, leaving the driveway and the people inside it behind. They thought they had taken everything from me. They thought they had left me with nothing but a ruined name and a pile of debt. They were wrong. They didn't know about the house in Malibu. They didn't know about the $1 million I had kept hidden. And soon, They were going to find out that when you kick someone out, you should make sure they don't have the power to take your world down with them. The humidity in Galveston always felt like a heavy, wet blanket, but stepping inside my parents' house was even worse. It was a place built on the idea of being someone you weren't. My mother had spent years turning the living room into a museum that no one ever visited. She kept every chair and sofa wrapped in thick, crinkling plastic covers, protecting the floral fabric from guests who never came. Every time I sat down, the plastic would groan and stick to the back of my legs. A constant reminder that I was just another thing that didn't quite belong in her perfect world. My father had his own way of pretending. Every Sunday morning, he didn't just get ready for the day. He performed a ritual. He would stand in the laundry room for an hour, his face set in a hard, grim line as he ironed a sharp, stiff crease into his blue jeans. He used so much starch the fabric felt like cardboard. It was his way of looking respectable to the neighbors. A glossy shell meant to hide the fact that the house was sinking under a mountain of debt they couldn't pay. They cared more about how things looked on a Facebook post than the actual truth of their lives. Then there was Ryan. He was the son my parents revolved around, the golden child who could do no wrong. He had this practiced, fake confidence and a smile that reminded me of a guy trying to sell you a car with a rolled-back odometer. While Ryan was out there playing the part of a successful businessman, spending money that didn't exist, and racking up bills he couldn't cover, I was standing on a hot runway halfway across the world. I spent years in the dirt and the heat, managing thousands of tons of supplies and moving equipment across borders, counting every single cent of my pay. While he was building a house of cards, I was building a life out of iron and sweat. They never saw the value in what I did. I still remember the day I told them I was moving away to work for the government. My mother didn't look proud. She looked at me with a cold, sharp disgust and said, "You make me ashamed." To them, wearing a uniform and working in a dusty warehouse wasn't classy. It wasn't as impressive as the law degree Ryan pretended to be working toward, a degree that was nothing more than an expensive piece of paper they used to brag to their friends. They didn't understand that the work they looked down on was the very thing that gave me my freedom. It gave me the ability to save every dollar, to be independent, and to keep secrets that they would never be able to touch. 4 months ago, the dust from the desert was still stuck in the back of my throat. I had just landed back on American soil, feeling the strange weight of a quiet life again. I was sitting in a small apartment, trying to figure out my next move, when my phone rang. It was my father. His voice didn't have its usual bark. It sounded thin and shaky, like a string about to snap. "Come home for dinner, Tinley," he said. "We need to talk. Your brother is in trouble, and we need the family together." My stomach dropped. That part of me that had been trained to spot a trap before the door slammed shut started screaming at me to stay away. I knew that talking usually meant they needed something I wasn't willing to give. I knew Ryan's trouble was probably a bill for $42,000 that he expected someone else to pay. But despite the shame they had piled on me, and despite the plastic-wrapped furniture and the fake smiles, they were still the only family I had. They were the one weakness I hadn't managed to cut out of my heart yet. "I'll be there," I told him. I hung up the phone and looked at my uniform hanging in the closet. I knew they hated it, so I put it on anyway. I drove toward Galveston, toward the smell of burnt pot roast and the sound of shattering glass, straight into the mess that would eventually lead me to the million-dollar secret in Malibu. I was walking into a fight I didn't want, but it was a fight I was more than ready to finish. Ryan walked through the front door 40 minutes late, his face flush with a fake kind of energy that always made my skin crawl. He didn't offer an apology for keeping us waiting. Instead, he pulled his keys from his pocket and tossed them onto the heavy wooden dining table. The metal keychain for his BMW hit the surface with a sharp, ringing screech that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. He was wearing a dark navy suit that looked like it belonged on a billboard, but as he turned to pull out a chair, I caught a glimpse of the white price tag still tucked neatly under the sleeve. It was exactly like him. Everything on the outside was built for show, a thin layer of expensive fabric trying to cover up the fact that he was drowning. He looked across the table at me, his eyes scanning my plain dark shirt, and the way I sat with my shoulders square. He let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You're still living like a grease-stained mechanic, aren't you, Tinley?" he asked, his voice dripping with a condescending pity that he'd used on me since we were kids. He knew I was a captain. He knew I managed multi-million-dollar supply chains. But to him, if I wasn't wearing a suit I couldn't afford, I was beneath him. My father didn't look up from his plate. He sat at the head of the table, his face tight and gray, carving into a thick piece of steak with an aggression that felt like he was trying to kill it a second time. The sound of the serrated knife scraping against the white porcelain was a jagged, rhythmic noise that set my nerves on edge. No one was talking about the elephant in the room, but the air was so thick with tension, I could practically taste it over the smell of the heavy gravy. Halfway through the meal, Ryan finally dropped the act. He set his fork down and looked me straight in the eye, his expression shifting into something desperate and hungry. He told me he needed $80,000 to keep his new company from folding, a company that I knew was nothing more than a ghost and a fancy website. My mother reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her palm feeling damp and cold. "Family helps each other, Tinley," she said, her voice soft and shaky, using that same manipulative tone she always used when she wanted to guilt me into fixing one of Ryan's messes. I didn't pull my hand away, but I did stop eating. I slowly placed my fork and knife down, making sure the metal hit the edge of the porcelain with a sharp, final clink that silenced the room. I didn't look at Ryan. I looked at my parents. "You already helped yourselves," I said, my voice coming out flat and cold as a winter morning. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a bank statement I had spent the last 3 nights studying. "You used my name and my social security number to take out a loan for $42,000. My father stopped carving. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He just leaned forward, his eyes hard and unblinking, and told me that it was a sacrifice I had to make for the family's future. They talked about my credit score and my financial life, like it was just a piece of scrap wood they could throw into a fire to keep Ryan warm. They had ruined my name to fund a lie, and they expected me to thank them for the privilege. But Ryan wasn't satisfied. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a snake slithering across the table. "What about the beach house in Malibu, Tinley?" he asked. My heart felt like it stopped for a split second. The secret I had worked 10 years to build, the $1 million safety net I had hidden away, was no longer a secret. He told me I should mortgage the place, give him the $80,000, and then we would all be fine. The room went completely silent. The pleading look in my mother's eyes evaporated, replaced instantly by a sharp, jagged hatred. She didn't care about the theft. She didn't care about the debt they'd put in my name. She only cared that I had something they couldn't touch. "You've been hiding money from this family?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. I looked at the 3 of them, sitting under the dim light of the dining room, and I realized the battle I had been dreading for years had finally arrived. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a war zone, and I was the only one who realized the fighting had already started. I sat in the middle of a cramped studio apartment in North Houston, watching the blue light of my phone screen flicker against the peeling paint on the walls. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the notification pings hadn't stopped for 2 hours. My mother's messages came in waves, each one more aggressive than the last, filled with capital letters that felt like someone was screaming directly into my ear. She kept using words like responsibility and family honor, as if they were weapons she could use to beat me into submission. One message stood out, a jagged line of text that asked me if the military had taught me to treat my own father with such cold ingratitude. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat in the dark with a cup of cold, bitter coffee, slowly copying every single message into an encrypted folder on my laptop. I could feel their presence like a virus, trying to leak out of the screen and infect the quiet, professional world I had built for myself. 2 days later, Ryan showed up. He didn't knock. He just pushed his way through the door with that same fake salesman smile he'd worn at the dinner table. He looked around my small room with a look of pure disgust, his eyes stopping on the small silver service medal I kept on the nightstand. He picked it up between 2 fingers like it was a piece of rotten food and tossed it into the far corner of the room. It hit the floorboards with a hollow metallic clink. He laughed, telling me that the little piece of tin wasn't worth as much as a single tire on his new BMW. I felt the skin on my forehead tighten, a single vein starting to pulse near my temple, but I didn't move. I didn't yell, and I certainly didn't hit him, even though every muscle in my body was screaming at me to do it. I knew what he was doing. He wanted me to lose my cool, to make a mistake that could get me in trouble with my superiors. I waited until he was done talking. Then I walked over, picked up the metal, and wiped the dust off it with my sleeve before placing it back in its steel box. By the end of the week, I agreed to meet my father at a cheap diner on the edge of town. The air inside smelled like old grease and floor cleaner, and the plastic menus were sticky to the touch. My father sat across from me, making sure to speak loud enough for the people in the next booth to hear him. He was putting on a show, bragging about how he had finally brought his rebellious daughter to her senses. He talked down to me for 20 minutes, telling me how things were going to work from now on, and how I was going to fix the financial hole Ryan had dug. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that the hole was actually $42,000 deep, and that it was mostly built on his own lies. I just nodded every few minutes and said the same 3 words. I've noted that. My father mistook my silence for a broken spirit. He got cocky, leaning back in the booth and letting a few more details slip about the money they had moved around and the documents they had signed in my name. When they finally left, walking out of the diner with the swagger of men who thought they had won a war, I stayed behind. I opened my notebook and wrote down the exact time they left. I logged every lie my father had just told, every dollar amount he had confirmed, and every threat he had made. I looked at the list of names and numbers, and I realized that any lingering hope I had for a real family was finally dead. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a bank account they could drain until it was empty. I closed the notebook with a sharp, heavy snap. They thought I was sitting there in the silence because I was defeated. They didn't know that when someone like me stops talking, it's because they're finally done measuring the distance and are getting ready to finish the job. I drove through the gates of the base, feeling the familiar hum of the tires on the asphalt. It was the only place where the world made sense. Out there, in Galveston, everything was built on lies and plastic-wrapped furniture. Here, there were rules, lines that no one crossed. I pulled my truck into a spot and sat there, listening to the high-pitched whine of a jet engine. The sound grounded me. I picked up my phone and made a call to Marcus Reed. We had been through a lot together, and he was the only person I trusted with a mess this ugly. He didn't interrupt when I told him about the $42,000. He just listened, his silence heavy on the other end of the line. I asked him to run a deep check on every transaction Ryan had made using my name. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. "I'm on it, Tinley," he said. "Give me a week." A few days later, I was standing in a large office with a mahogany desk and a view of the training grounds. I stood straight, hands behind my back, facing the man who had been my boss for 3 years. He valued honesty, which made what I had to say harder. I had to admit that my own father and brother had used my identity like a tool. I had to tell him that my family was a threat to my financial security. He looked at me over his glasses, eyes filled with disappointment that wasn't directed at me, but at the world I came from. "Are you sure you want to push this, Tinley?" he asked. "This kind of paperwork doesn't just go away. It will tear your family's name to pieces in a public record." I looked him right in the eye, jaw set tight. My mind was clearer than it had ever been. "They already tore it to pieces, sir," I replied. "I'm just here to clean up the wreckage." 1 week later, a thick manila folder arrived, stamped in red ink with a warning that it was for my eyes only. I sat at my small kitchen table and opened the plastic clip. The smell of fresh ink and crisp paper filled the room. As I turned the pages, the truth started to bleed out in black and white. There it was, my father's signature on a loan application, a clumsy imitation of my handwriting. Records showed money flowing from Ryan's fake business directly into high-end nightclubs in downtown Houston. The folder contained dozens of pages of proof. It showed how they systematically drained my credit to buy things they couldn't afford, while telling me I was a disappointment. These weren't numbers on a screen. They were evidence of a crime. This folder had the weight of the law. It was a weapon that Ryan wouldn't talk his way out of. He wouldn't be able to smirk and toss a medal in a corner when he saw this. I closed the folder, the plastic spine snapping shut with a sharp sound like a door locking. I didn't feel like celebrating or crying. I just felt a strange, quiet peace. I looked at a piece of paper next to the folder, the guest list for my grandmother Evelyn's birthday party. Every relative we had would be there. Every person my father and brother used as an audience for their fake success would be watching. I thought about taking this folder to a police station now, but I pushed that thought away. A quiet arrest wouldn't teach a man as arrogant as Ryan the lesson he deserved. I wanted him to see his world fall apart in front of everyone he cared about. I wanted him to feel the ground vanish under his feet, right when he thought he was sitting at the very top of the entire world and had absolutely nothing left to lose or to fear from a sister he thought he had already beaten once and for all during that awful dinner back in Galveston. It would be the perfect place to finally end the long fight and find my peace. The silence was a choice, but to Ryan, it looked like a white flag. My phone sat on the nightstand, buzzing with his messages. He was talking about my bank accounts again, saying he was going to take over my assets because I was too unstable to handle my own life. He wanted a reaction to prove I was unstable. I didn't give it to him. I typed 3 words, "I heard you," and put the phone face down. To a man like Ryan, my lack of a fight was a win. He started posting on social media immediately, vague updates about family unity and how he was finally stepping up to lead us into a new era. I sat in the dark of my Houston apartment, lit only by street lamps reflecting off the rain. The downpour drummed a steady rhythm matching my heart. I reached for my boots. I didn't need to wear them for a few days, but the routine was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I dipped the brush into the tin of black polish. The smell of leather and wax grounded me. I began to work the brush over the scuffed toes in slow, circular motions. Every swipe of the bristles was a way to anchor myself. I had been through months of heat and dust, managing supplies in heat that felt like fire. I survived that. But this slow-motion car crash with my own parents was harder than anything I'd faced overseas. Family betrayal is a slow erosion, like water eating stone until only dust remains. I felt an exhaustion that went deeper than my bones. It was a fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. I watched the clock, counting the hours. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus. I picked it up on the first ring. "Tinley, I've got enough here to call the local cops and have them at your father's door by breakfast," he said, his voice tight. "Why are we sitting on this?" I stood up and walked to the window. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking. "Because if I stop him now, Marcus, he'll just find a way to make it my fault," I said. My voice was flat. "He'll cry to the neighbors, telling everyone I'm a heartless daughter attacking her father over a misunderstanding. He'll play the victim until everyone believes him. I need him to walk into the center of the room. I need him to stand there in front of everyone he's ever lied to and show them exactly who he is. I'm not just stopping him. I'm ending the entire system they've built." The mine was already buried, and Ryan was about to step right on it. He called me an hour later, sounding fake and warm. He was inviting me to grandmother Evelyn's 85th birthday party at the country club. He told me it would be a new beginning and mentioned he'd have some papers for me to sign, something about an asset authorization that would protect my interests. He had already been bragging to the aunts about how he had finally managed to tame his wild sister. I looked over at my dress uniform hanging on the closet door. The gold buttons caught the light with a cold promise. I knew what would happen tomorrow. I knew the price. I knew Ryan would be at the peak of his pride in that ballroom. He would be smiling, thinking he had won. He didn't know that every step he took toward that podium was a step closer to the end of his world. I picked up the brush and went back to my boots. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was no longer empty. It was the silence of a long, dark night, right before the sun finally comes up to burn everything to the ground. I stood in front of the tall mirror in a cold Houston hotel room, watching the gray light of the afternoon fade over the city's skyline. The air in the room was stale, smelling of industrial carpet cleaner and the faint, bitter scent of old coffee. I reached for my dark navy uniform, the heavy wool feeling like a familiar weight against my skin. I fastened each silver button slowly, making sure every ribbon and pin was aligned to the exact fraction of an inch. I wasn't looking at my reflection to admire the achievements I had earned through years of sweat and heat. I was looking for a target that wasn't there yet. The clock on the wall was ticking, each second sounding like a heavy, hollow thud in the silence. I picked up the thick manila folder with the red stamp on the cover and placed it into my black leather briefcase. I closed the latch with a sharp, final click that echoed off the bare walls. I was ready. The double doors of the country club ballroom swung open, and the thick, wet heat of the Texas night was instantly cut off by the blast of the industrial air conditioner. I walked inside, my back straight and my polished leather shoes hitting the marble floor with a rhythmic sound that seemed to cut through the noise of the crowd. I scanned the room like I was looking for a leak in a high-pressure pipe. The place smelled of expensive perfume, spilled bourbon, and the kind of fake success that people buy when they are drowning in debt. I saw Ryan at the center of the room, surrounded by a group of men in suits that cost more than their cars. He was holding a glass of whiskey and laughing too loud, his face flushed with the pride of a man who thought he had finally won. My father stood next to him, his shoulders hunched and his face looking thin and gray under the bright light of the chandeliers. He was trying to force a smile for the neighbors, but his eyes were darting toward the door. I didn't stop to greet anyone. I moved to a quiet corner where the light didn't reach, and I waited. Across the room, two men in dark gray suits walked in through the back entrance near the kitchen. One was wearing steel-framed glasses and carried a small leather bag, and the other had a face as hard and expressionless as a brick wall. They didn't look at me, and they didn't go near the bar. They just stood at the edge of the party, sipping plain water and watching Ryan with a cold, professional focus. One was a legal expert from the city, and the other was a man who spent his life looking at every single cent people tried to hide. We didn't exchange a single word. A quick, almost invisible nod between us was the only signal that the net had been closed. Every exit was blocked, and Ryan was too busy bragging to notice that the room was getting smaller. Ryan finally stepped up to the small podium at the front of the hall and tapped his glass with a silver spoon. The room went quiet, the music fading into the background. He started into a long, flowery speech about family values, about the traditions we built, and the sacrifices we all had to make to stay on top. He sounded like a man who believed his own lies. Then, he looked directly at me and invited his proud sister to join him on the stage. He called me the backbone of the family, a hero who had finally come home to help us secure our future. He thought he had me cornered. He thought that in front of all these people, I would be too afraid to say no. I walked up the steps slowly, every step sounding like a hammer hitting a nail. When I reached the top, Ryan leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive alcohol. He whispered so only I could hear, telling me that everything was over and that I should just sign the papers and let us all be happy. My father stood on the other side, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch my arm. "It's time to end this, daughter," he said, his voice a shaky plea for me to give up. I looked at the two of them, and then I looked out at the room full of people who were waiting for a show. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt a cold, sharp clarity. "No, Father," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to the very back of the hall. "The work is not over. It has only just begun." Ryan leaned over the mahogany podium, sliding a blue leather folder toward me with a flourish that made the silverware on the nearby tables rattle. The grand ballroom of the Houston Country Club was filled with the smell of expensive lilies and the muffled sounds of high society small talk. "It's just a formality, Tinley," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the tables of aunts and uncles in the front row. "To finalize the property transfer and get the family back on solid ground." He held out a gold-plated pen, his eyes shining with the frantic, greedy energy of a man who thought he had finally cornered his prey. He believed that with the pressure of the entire family watching, I would be too afraid of a public scandal to say no. I didn't reach for the pen. I stood perfectly still, my hands locked firmly behind my back, my posture as straight as a steel rod. I didn't look at the papers. I looked directly into Ryan's eyes, watching the sweat start to bead at his hairline. The silence in the hall began to stretch, turning from a polite pause into a heavy, suffocating weight. People stopped cutting their steak. The jazz band in the corner trailed off into a confused hush. Ryan's fake salesman's smile began to waver, the corners of his mouth twitching with an impatience he couldn't hide. "Just sign it, honey," my father urged from his seat, his voice thin and shaky as he tried to maintain his role as the head of the house. I gave a short, sharp nod toward the back of the room. Immediately, the man with the steel-framed glasses, the legal expert I had contacted, stepped out from the shadows near the kitchen entrance. A sudden chill seemed to sweep through the room, cutting through the thick, humid air of the party. He walked up the steps to the stage, his black shoes hitting the floor with a rhythmic, heavy thud that sounded like a gavel hitting a block. He didn't look at the guests. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a professional identification card, holding it up for everyone to see. "I am here to execute a restricted financial investigation and protect the personal assets of Captain Tinley Myers," he announced. His voice was flat and dry, carrying a kind of authority that made the room go completely cold. Ryan's face didn't just go pale, it turned the color of gray, wet plaster. The gold pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the podium, falling to the floor with a tiny, hollow sound. The legal expert opened the thick manila folder I had given him, the red stamp on the cover visible to everyone in the firm. He didn't waste time with a greeting. He began to read. Identity theft. Fraudulent revenue reports. Federal tax evasion. Behind him, the large projector screen that Ryan had used for his family legacy slideshow flickered and changed. Marcus Reed was working the system from a secure location miles away. Giant black numbers filled the screen, stripping away every lie Ryan had ever told. $42,000 in credit card debt stolen in my name. $80,000 in business loans taken out using my social security number while I was overseas. Another $100,000 in hidden accounts that were being drained to pay for Ryan's car and his suits. My father stared at the screen, his face collapsing as the reality of the crimes hit him. He slumped back into his cushioned chair, his eyes going wide and hollow. My mother stood there like a statue, her hand pressed against her mouth as she looked at her golden child and realized she was looking at a criminal. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector fan. The aunts and uncles were staring at Ryan with a mix of shock and disgust. The fake world he had built was falling apart in front of every person he had ever tried to impress. I felt nothing but a cold, heavy sense of completion. I didn't smile, and I didn't stay to watch him beg. I turned around and walked down the steps, my shoes hitting the floor with the same steady rhythm I had used when I walked out of that kitchen in Galveston. I was halfway to the exit when Ryan caught up to me. He grabbed my arm, his fingers shaking so hard he could barely hold on. His voice was a thin, desperate whisper that barely sounded human. "Tinley, please, what are you going to do to me next?" I stopped and looked at him over my shoulder. He looked like a machine that had finally been unplugged, all the light and noise gone from his eyes. "The play is over, Ryan," I said, my voice quiet and sharp. "Welcome to the real world." The party was over, but the air in the room felt heavier than it had when the jazz band was playing. The crowd had cleared out faster than smoke in a windstorm, leaving behind a mess of half-eaten crab cakes and shattered champagne flutes on the cold marble floor. I stood at the edge of the wooden stage, slowly peeling off my white dress gloves. I folded them and placed them inside my black leather briefcase, right next to the folder that had just ended my brother's fake career. My father was sitting on one of the metal folding chairs near the front, his head buried in his hands. He looked small, like a man who had finally realized his house of cards was made of nothing but debt and lies. My mother walked toward me, her makeup smeared under her eyes, her face twisted in a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "You destroyed this family," she hissed, her voice echoing in the empty hall. "You stood up there and ripped us apart in front of everyone we know. I hope you're happy." I looked at her, but I didn't see a mother. I saw a stranger, a woman who had spent 30 years trying to shape me into a tool she could use for her own social standing. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I just watched her, the way I would watch a broken machine that was past the point of repair. I didn't rip this family apart, I said, my voice as flat as the Texas plains. I just turned the lights on. If the truth destroyed you, then you were already dead long before I walked into this room. My father finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and watery. He smelled of cheap cigarettes and the expensive bourbon he couldn't actually afford. He tried to stand, but his legs seemed to give out, and he slumped back down into the chair. "I did it for you, Tinley," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "I did it so we wouldn't be the laughingstock of the neighborhood. I did it to protect your name as much as Ryan's." He was still trying to play the hero, still trying to wrap his theft in the flag of family honor. It was a lie he had told himself so many times that he actually believed it. Ryan was gone, of course. He had run for the back door the second the legal team started reading the numbers. He was a coward who hid behind my credit score until the bill finally came due. I felt a surge of disgust, a cold knot in the center of my chest. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the quiet peace of finality. "You didn't do it for me," I said, my words cutting through his excuses like a razor. "You did it because you were too weak to tell Ryan no. You did it because you cared more about the BMW in the driveway and the country club membership than you did about your own daughter's life. You called my career trash. You told me I was uneducated because I didn't have a fake law degree from a school that doesn't exist. But the second you needed $42,000 to pay for Ryan's mistakes, suddenly I was the only hope for this family." I stepped down from the stage, the sound of my shoes hitting the floor like a hammer hitting a nail. My mother tried to block my path, her hands shaking. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice turning into a high-pitched plea. "Are you going to send your own parents to jail? Is that what you want for us?" I walked past her and stood by the large windows, looking out at the city of Houston as the rain started to pound against the glass. The streetlights below were just blurry yellow dots in the darkness. I didn't turn around to look at them. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "Not an apology, not the money you stole, and certainly not your love. You can't give me what you don't have." The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of it. I picked up my bag and adjusted the strap on my shoulder. "The biggest punishment I can give you is my absence," I told them. "From this second on, I am dead to you. Don't call me, don't write. You've officially been orphaned by the only child who ever actually cared. Goodbye." I walked out the door and stepped into the rain, leaving them alone in the wreckage of a life they had spent 30 years destroying. Malibu greeted Tinley with a morning that looked like polished silver. She stood on the wide wooden balcony of her villa, her hands gripping the railing. Below the cliffs, the Pacific Ocean was a massive beast, its white surf crashing against the jagged rocks with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The air was cold, smelling of salt spray and the sharp scent of eucalyptus leaves. The silence here was absolute. There were no more voices echoing in the hallways, no more smell of burnt grease from a kitchen she hated, and no more weight of people who only loved her when they needed her bank account. She walked back inside, the floorboards cool under her feet. She unbuttoned the navy dress uniform she had worn to the party, the heavy fabric finally coming off her shoulders. She placed it on a cedar hanger, smoothing out the sleeves. The silver buttons and colorful ribbons didn't look like trophies. They looked like the armor she finally got to take off. The war in Texas was over. Her phone buzzed on a cedar table near the window. She saw a message from her mother, sent at 3 a.m. when the world was dark. It was a wall of text, a winding path of guilt and excuses. Her mother wrote about her father's failing health and mentioned that Ryan was now a wanted man with the police knocking on their door every afternoon. The message shifted to that familiar warmth, asking Tinley to come home for a Sunday dinner so they could fix their misunderstandings. Tinley read the words and felt a strange sense of boredom. The manipulation felt like a script she had seen too many times before. She didn't feel the old sting of betrayal, and she didn't feel the urge to explain herself to anyone ever again. She simply swiped the notification away and deleted the entire thread without a second thought. She didn't owe them a single reply. She didn't owe them her presence ever again in this life or the next life at all today. She walked to the kitchen and poured a cup of black coffee, the steam rising in the cool air. She looked at a small, jagged scar on her forearm, a reminder of a long deployment where the sun never stopped burning. She realized her parents and her brother were just another type of deployment. They were a territory she had survived, and they had left scars that would never fade. She accepted them as part of her gear, the price she had to pay to become the woman standing in this room. She picked up the phone and dialed Aunt Diane. The conversation was brief and focused on numbers. Tinley arranged for an anonymous payment to cover her parents' housing for the next 12 months. It wasn't an act of love or forgiveness. It was a final transaction. It was the last payment she would ever make to keep her conscience clean. She had paid the bill. She was finally debt-free and completely untouchable and safe in her own home today, and also forever. As the sun began to climb over the hills, turning the Pacific into hammered gold, Tinley walked down to the beach. She left her shoes on the bottom step and walked toward the water, her bare feet sinking into the cold, wet sand. The waves rolled in, the icy water swirling around her ankles and toes. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again. Her mother was calling. Tinley pulled the device out, looked at the name on the screen for exactly 3 seconds, and then slid it back into her pocket. She didn't feel like a hero or a victim. She just felt like herself. "My responsibility ends where my boundary begins," she said, her voice lost in the roar of the surf. She looked out at the endless horizon, knowing the battle was truly finished. Tonight, for the first time in 32 years, she would sleep a deep, dreamless sleep, safe in a house no one else could ever touch or destroy or take anything from her.